All right. All right, friends. We're going to go ahead and get started. First of all, just an important administrative note. We are recording today's session, so folks who weren't able to be here today can view it afterwards. That's also a note. Be on your best behavior. I was just talking to Doug. He was planning on throwing over a table, but he's not going to do that now because it's. Anyway, all right. For folks who don't know me, I'm Sandy Barua. I'm with the Detroit Regional Chamber, and I'm delighted to have these friends and partners in the room today. And I'm just so pleased and proud that so many of you have been with us as partners and funders in our own journey around racial justice and economic equity, and our longstanding partnership with Gallup, and particularly the Gallup Center on Black Voices. And I want to start by recognizing our friends from Gallup who are here today. So first, Dan Foy, Dan's here. And then Telly, pronounce your last name for me, Telly. Daboudi, thank you, is here. And you're going to be hearing from Camille Lloyd, who is the Executive Director of the Gallup Center on Black Voices. And you're also going to be hearing from my longtime friend, the Chairman of Gallup, Jim Clifton. So you'll hear from them in just a moment. So, we as the Detroit Regional Chamber, we are certainly not the authority on racial justice, but we recognized a few years ago, like many organizations, particularly business organizations, that we had to do more and we had a long road ahead of us. And so we kind of broke down our work in three buckets. First, and perhaps most importantly, we needed to look internally. We needed to look internally, and we needed to do work internally, and we've been doing that now for 3 years. And I want to recognize our leader internally on our racial justice and economic equity work, and our leader externally, Marnita Harris, our Vice President for Racial Justice and Economic Equity. The second thing we realized is that we needed to work with others. We needed to learn from others, and we knew that we had a unique platform in terms of resources, in terms of communication reach into certain audiences, and we needed to work with others. And I want to thank from the bottom of my heart all the folks who have been engaged either from day one or late arrivals into the Racial Equity Blueprint Group. So thank you all very, very much. The work that Camille is going to go through, the deep dive, the customized survey for Detroit and the Detroit region was not crafted by Gallup alone. It certainly was not crafted by the staff of the Detroit Regional Chamber. That's probably the last thing you wanted. It was crafted and inputted by the members of the Racial Equity Blueprint Group and their partners, which is why we have such a fabulous result. And thirdly, we needed to figure out what our role is as the largest business organization in the state. We needed to figure out how do we use our platform to influence business leaders as to why racial equity, economic equity issues were important to you as a business leader, important to your business, why this is good for business, and why it's good for your overall economy. And we were able to, kind of coalesce around programs around that. And that brings us to our work with the Gallup Center on Black Voices. So we have been proud to partner with the world-class resources of Gallup for this. This has been a journey of partnership and learning. It has been a journey now of almost 3 years, but thanks to all of you, we have a world-class survey. Year one, we're just getting started. This is not a one and done deal. Our goal is to make sure that we have the resources and the partnership to continue and to expand this work. So leading us off today, I am incredibly proud to kick things off with Jim Clifton. Jim Clifton is the chairman of Gallup. Jim has been a dear friend for more years than either he and I want to count, but more importantly, he is a mentor. He is one of the certified, smart, insightful people on this planet, sincerely. And he has been not just a personal leader, but a professional leader in areas of equity in an incredibly thoughtful and insightful way. So Jim, thank you for being here. The fact that you are here as the chairman of Gallup underscores the importance of this work and underscores the importance to Gallup with this partnership. So Jim, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sandy. I came here for only one thing. I actually just wanted to tell you thank you. I could sit down now. And I want to tell you people thank you. Thank you too. We've really been working hard. You know, when you start something or you're trying to solve a big problem, a lot of people just give up on you. But you gotta just keep going and going. Well, one of the things we learned is that I learned this from the founder of our company, George Gallup. He spent his whole life, he just had a question. He wanted to ask people how their lives were going. He was an academic. But he said, we have all the transactions of life. We know all the economics and how much people buy and when they were born, when they went to the dentist and all that. But nobody ever just stops you and say, how's your life going? And after Minneapolis, the founder of the Thurgood Marshall College Fund, just an incredible lady, Ann Joyce Payne, I don't know if you know her or not, she changed my life. But so Gallup said, what could we do together that would make a real contribution? And we decided that we would do our very best work with Black Americans, and the best way we're going to ask them how their lives are going. Because when you go to solve a problem, the biggest ones in the world, whether you're going to Mars or war, whatever you're doing, it always begins with one question. What can you measure? And if the answer is the measurement's an argument, like it's worse than it's ever been, no, Sandy says it's the best it's ever, you see what I mean? You got to have measurement. But it's a pretty good leadership lesson, because whatever the location is of the current state of mind with Black America, let's just say in Detroit. We pledged to do it for 100 years. Gallup, our own money, doing it for 100 years here in the United States of America. But the reason is that you got to keep doing it as leaders. If you can only see the location of a current mood, it's not very helpful. Do you know why? You don't know where it came from. So you also have to see direction. You have to see direction and speed. We were just talking, right now, we built consistent sampling frames across 160 countries to get you 98% of the world's population. We just want to know how the whole world's doing. The answer, you guys, is not great. The anger has been rising systematically in the world since we started that 16 years ago. I always call it the other global warming. Where the hell is that going, you see? If the world just keeps getting madder and madder, we're doing a little bit better here in the United States, but we're really excited because there's something of value to leaders to audit and get measurement. Your job in Detroit is not to turn around whatever the current situation it is. It's to use very, very, very strong hands and just get it headed the right way. If you get the ship headed the right way, that's really what leaders do. And we're anxious to be a part of that measurement. The reason I wanted to thank all of you, no other city's doing this, and they should be. We're doing our thing for the for the United States. But if this could be the city where people say, hey, do you know what's going on Detroit? They're measuring this and they're figuring it out. They build a listening machine that is incredible. But maybe it could start here. So thank you. I'm going to introduce my colleague, who's a lot better on this subject than I am, Camille Lloyd. She works with me in the Gallup. She's actually a personal friend of mine too, but she doesn't ask me to help her much with her research work. I don't know why that. I need to talk to you about that, Camille. But she's the mother of 2 twins. She works on all kinds of projects. I think 2 of her favorite might be the Library of Congress and the Department of Labor. But the one that we're working on today, and I think she's having a lot of fun, but as you said, she's the executive director of our brand new institute for Black Voices. So with that, thank you. Camille, you're on.
All right, thank you, Jim. All right. It's good to be back in Detroit. It's always good to be in Detroit. And good to see familiar faces. So one of the things we wanted to do with this particular deep dive is not have it be a monologue. You all have probably seen some of the data. The report's been out for a while, but to really also generate some conversation. And that's the part of this discussion that I am particularly looking forward to. As we think about when we were doing the design of this study, and I see so many familiar faces from our partners and stakeholders, and we said, well, when we get data and we figure out what we want to ask, and we know and we have the answers, what are we going to do and how can we use the data as that common premise? And I think today is also kind of a manifestation of that, walking out those objectives that we started out with this particular study and saying, what does amplifying Detroiters' voices do for the process of decision making, for particularly you as leaders, and how you can leverage now that we know and we've heard from residents, how can we leverage these data to create deeper understanding of how people's lives are going, where their expectations of change lie in terms of where they want to see change in their lives so that they can achieve equitable life outcomes. And so I think that the fact that we're in this room is such an incredibly encouraging point to be at. As Jim mentioned about being the first, we've approached a number of cities. We had some pilot cities. So being the first to actually kind of walk this proof of concept, which is engaging residents into this process, listening to those experiences, quantifying those experiences, and now having data to help with that decision making, I think is the part that gets me giddy. One of the things we started out, and so for some of you all, is to really kind of put a frame around the questions we ask, and to that single thing is, how are people doing? And so we have the measure on the study that really kind of allow for us to assess what we will call a subjective measure of overall well-being as people rate their life, evaluate it in their life. So this is a structure in the form of measuring overall well-being. There are other measures of well-being that probably look at some more health outcomes, more driven around those aspects. But using the life evaluation question is an aspect of measuring subjective well-being. And we wanted to do that for Detroiters. And so it's a question that we ask on the survey. And so we ask Detroiters, to rate their current and their future lives. And what that allows for us to do is to be able to quantify and to bucket whether or not individuals are thriving, struggling, or suffering. And so from the answers to those questions on our life evaluation measures, we're able to understand a little bit more about residents and what that looks like for residents in Detroit as far as overall life evaluation. So when we think about thriving, and what that means, it's really, well-being that is strong, consistent, and progressing. And what we see for Detroiters specifically is that Detroiters who are thriving, think about their outlook, which is their future life, because we ask them 5 years from now where you think you would be on that ladder, also optimistic about what their life will be like 5 years from now. And that's that description of what's happening where we're seeing the Detroiters who are in this thriving bucket, what we see in terms of the other questions around their everyday experiences that we're asking and what's happening in their lives. The other thing in terms of struggling is really well-being. It's moderate, or there's some inconsistency, right? I might be doing well in some aspects of my life, might be good on the physical sense, but financially, there's some worry and some concern there. But what we know from Detroiters is that those who are struggling in their well-being, they're mostly satisfied, so there is some level of satisfaction with the education system and the availability of healthcare and good jobs in the area where they live. Most of them do not feel, however, that they have what they need in order to achieve their career and financial goals. And what we see here also is that they're also more likely to be dissatisfied with the availability of housing in their neighborhood, right? So individuals, again, based on where you're scoring on that ladder, that are falling in, this is what we know characteristically about how they're rating their lives on those other areas where we're asking about their experiences. For suffering, this is really well-being that's at high risk. what we see from Detroiters who are suffering in their well-being, these are the folks that are least likely to be satisfied with the availability of good affordable housing where they live. Few feel that they have what they need for their career and financial goals. So when you start to think about, having the things that you need in order to prepare yourself for the future, and you'll hear us talk a little bit more about that as we go deeper in the data, they're also more likely to report having health ailments. There was a series of diagnoses that we asked on the survey from a physical health perspective. What we see is that individuals who are falling within this bucket based on the measure, we see that they are more likely to have health ailments, and about 2 out of 3 of them do not believe they can get ahead with hard work living in Detroit. All right, so the numbers. So what we see overall in being able to look at it, we see 50% of all area residents, so thinking about the region, that give life evaluations that would allow for them to fall in that thriving bucket that I just described, right? So overall for the region, it's about 50%. Well, how does this compare to what we know and see in our national data? So we know for Black Americans, it's slightly lower, it's 52%, but when we start to think about mathematics, it's pretty much very, very similar in what we see on national trends, both for the US population as well as for Black adults in the US overall. So we see 50% of all area residents that are falling in the thriving, an additional 45% that are in that struggling bucket, and 5% that's in suffering. One of the things as we started to think about going deeper in this data for this conversation is, well, where are those aspects, who rather is more likely to be thriving in Detroit, and what does that look like from a racial and ethnic breakdown, but also when we look at it across city residents, where are those pockets of thriving? So when we see in terms of who's more likely to be thriving, when we look at city residents, we see that white residents are more likely to be thriving in their overall well-being than Black residents, and Hispanic residents in the middle, very similar to what we see among white residents. However, what we see in terms of a pattern and a trend is that those that are 65 years or older are much more likely to be thriving. So those city residents that are 65 years and older are much more likely to be thriving. And this will come up as we go deeper in the conversation about what does that mean for young Detroiters. And particularly when we look deeper into these data, we see that this idea of optimism for the future, so how you're rating what your life will be like 5 years from now, that's some of where we're seeing some of that differences by age playing out a little bit, where we see less likely to be optimistic about what my life would look like 5 years from now among younger Detroiters. Okay. One of the things that we also, so now that we know how people are doing and we have a framework to put around it, which is this overall well-being framework, is, well, what are those determinants? What are those things about our everyday experiences or about Detroiters' everyday experiences that are, driving or determining how they rate themselves on that latter question, right? So whether it's particularly around currently, what is it about what I'm experiencing in my current life that's determining whether I'm giving a 0, between a 0 and a 10. So what we see, and this is in order of importance, is what we see is that economic opportunity. So individuals' responses about the view that they have about their ability of getting ahead by working hard. If Detroiters rate this item particularly high, we see that they're much more likely to also rate their current life evaluation high enough to be falling in that thriving category. The other most important categories really around their overall satisfaction with the availability of jobs and the availability of job training services. So you start to think about that lever. Do I have what I need in order to kind of give myself a chance to be successful through the elements of what I'm able to do, what I'm qualified to do, and the overall availability of jobs that are available to me in my area. The other thing is education, particularly around the access to high quality public schools and the ability to leverage opportunity to achieve their career and financial goals. So when we see Detroiters who are able to rate these items really high in terms of their overall satisfaction with the quality of the educational system or the access to quality schools, and or feel like they have an ability to leverage opportunity to achieve their career goals, much more likely to rate their overall current life evaluation really high and high enough to be falling within the thriving bucket. There are other elements that are important other than economic opportunity, access to jobs and work, and education that also comes out in how Detroiters' everyday experiences are impacting how well they rate their lives today. And that's around health and well-being, particularly as it relates to access to quality health care, satisfaction with the availability of quality health care in the area where they live, and particular community aspects of the community and environment where they feel like they live in a neighborhood where people care about each other, and their overall satisfaction with neighborhood services and conditions. And I want to just take a pause here because you'll hear us talk about neighborhood services and conditions quite a bit throughout this deep dive. And that's particularly around the services that are available to you in your community and your neighborhood, as well as your access to build social capital, whether that's through recreational, access to recreational opportunities, access to markets with fresh fruits and vegetables, neighborhoods that are free of blight, the ability to rate neighborhood services like fire and snow removal and air quality really well. So this is the aspect of the environment in which I live in is driving my current life evaluation. And the one thing I'll add here is where justice show up. This is really an important factor for individuals living in the suburbs. So less so much for residents who live in the city. This element of justice and satisfaction with overall law enforcement was important, but came up as an important driver for residents who were living in the suburbs and less so much for residents living in the city. All right, so the next question was, who is more likely to want to move away? We had that in the question that we asked on the survey, and we also wanted to understand to what extent about people's everyday experiences that might be contributing to who wants to leave and who wants to stay. That was the next element to say, okay, what does that look like in terms of what Detroiters are planning to do? And so we asked the question about, if you had the opportunity to move away in the next 12 months, would you do so? What we see in terms of the data here is that Hispanic residents are most likely to say that they will continue living in Detroit. And 43% of city residents would prefer to continue living in Detroit, while 57% said that they would move permanently to another area if they had the opportunity. And we'll talk a little bit more about where it is that people are thinking about moving and why they're thinking about moving. And so when we see in terms of city residents specifically, 46% say that they would go somewhere else in the city of Detroit or to the Detroit suburbs, rather than outside of the metro area. So there's an element of, might not be getting what I need where I'm currently living, and this is kind of my intention. When we look in terms of city residents who say they would want to move permanently to another area, race, ethnicity, we see that Black city residents are significantly more likely to say they would want to move to another area, with 58% of Black residents compared to 50% of white residents and 47% of Hispanic residents. All right, so why do people want to move? Well, the most common reasons that we see in terms of why people want to leave the city is crime. So we see 62% said that they would want to leave because crime is too high in the area. And to round out the top three, people are looking for a better place to raise their children. And that's where the aspect of education and the quality of education comes in. And that's probably why we see that connection to how people are rating their current life evaluation and contributing to whether or not they're thriving. It's an important element to say, I want a better place to raise my children. What does that look like? I think education and the access to education and the quality of the education system plays a little bit into people's perception of what's a better place. The other thing is also to have job and business opportunities that are better elsewhere. As we go through the presentation, we'll look a little bit into this better place to raise children, but what does the business opportunity look like as well? All right. So what do we know about those who are most likely to move? So we did a regression model to say, well, who are these people who are, kind of making up that 57%? So when we see for city residents, they're most likely to be Black residents and young people, 18 to 34, compared to those that are 35 years or older that are more likely to say that they want to move. These are residents that have lesser amount of education, so those with less than a graduate degree, those who are not homeowners, and those who have what you would consider a lower social connection as measured by the number of close friends you have living in your neighborhood, and those who have not lived in the city for a very long time. So those are the people in terms of building out to say, well, who do we see that, what do they look like, that those individuals who are saying that they want to move out of the city? And so this aspect of social capital, we see that that was an important predictor. The number of friends that you say you have that are residents that are living, number of close friends that you have that live in your neighborhood, we see that that was an important predictor of whether or not individuals wanted to move away from the city or not. Okay? All right. So one of the things that we wanted to do was then say, okay, all right, so we know your ability to build social capital or to increase your social capital as measured to the number of friends was an important predictor of your likelihood or not likelihood to want to move away. And so when we map that across Detroit neighborhoods and we see that residents that was living in St. John, Boynton, and Davidsonville, that this is where we were saying the individuals were reporting having the highest level in terms of the number of friends that they have living in their area. So if you wanted to use that as a proxy for social capital, so this is where we see social capital as measured in the number of close friends were highest in those communities, in those neighborhoods. All right. Next thing I want to talk about is economic opportunity. You notice that in addition to your perception of being able to get ahead being like the #1 determinant for overall thriving, we want to talk about economic opportunity and what we see in the data through economic health, entrepreneurship, and economic mobility. Particularly when we look at, we created this measure, so we had a series of questions that asked people about different aspects of their lives related to financial security, housing security, the ability to pay for your basic needs, and what we created was this economic health indicator. So in order to have high economic health on this measure that we created, you would have to have had responses to questions that you said that you had a level of comfort, so you would have some level of comfort with being able to live on your present income, that you said that you had not worried about money in the last 7 days, and that you had what you think you had some of what you need in order to achieve your financial goals, that you said that you had enough money in the past 12 months to pay for healthcare, housing, and food, and that you felt satisfied with your standard of living. So if you were able to score positively on those questions, we consider or counted you as having high economic health on this indicator measure that we created. When we look at that measure and we divide it up into quartiles, we see that 63% of city residents in the bottom of the economic health indicator group are those who are also saying that they would like to move away permanently. Okay? All right. So when we look across this economic health indicator item for city residents, we see that 19% of Hispanic residents are falling in the top quartile versus 13% of Black residents and 6% of white residents. So I know before the question comes that this is something that also seems, well, how is that the case? One of the things that we see coming out, particularly when we look at the data by race ethnicity, is this aspect of when we put in the ability to build social capital and access to high quality neighborhood services and that particular variable, we see that when Black and Hispanic residents are able to give those items a 5 or to rate them high, that they were much more likely than white residents to be in the top quartile on the economic health indicator that we created. Okay. All right. This other aspect about, what do people see for opportunity? So when you think about the things that are impacting Detroiters' current life evaluation, this ability to access economic opportunity is a big and important driver. So we wanted to look at it, the questions that we've asked that could be a proxy for what are people seeing for opportunity. One of those questions was we asked the question about, whether or not you plan to start a business within the next 12 months. So what we see in terms of all Detroit city residents, about 13% of city residents say that they were planning to start a business within the next 12 months. So when we look a little bit deeper in terms of who's saying, among that 18% that's saying that they're looking to start a business in the next 12 months, we see that 79% of those individuals are Black residents, 7% Hispanic, and 6% white. Overall, though, what we see is that Black residents are twice as likely as white residents to say that they are planning to start a business in the next 12 months. And you see that distribution by age in terms of who's interested in or who told us they were interested in starting a business in the next 12 months. Well, what does that look like in terms of the questions we ask about what are some of those barriers and impediments that they see? So what we see in terms of what current business ownerships look like. And we see that overall, 15% of Black residents own businesses currently, are business owners. We see that, again, overall, 18% are planning to start a business. But when we ask people about whether you have the resources you need, so overall, thinking about all city residents, we see 81% say, of those who are planning to start a business, say they do not have the financial and non-financial resources to start a business. But particularly, even though we see higher interest among Black residents are almost 2 times more likely than all other residents to say that they do not have the resources that they need to start the business that they want. So when you start to think about, how are people accessing and leveraging and perceiving opportunity in this city, we see that when it comes to this case study of wanting to start a business, we do see some disparities in that desire and whether or not people think that they have the resources to do so. All right, I'm going to turn to Dan. We'll talk a little bit more about this case study, about what we see in the Detroit data related to the drivers of well-being, but also related to...
Can I make one comment?
Sure. All right, we'll do comment while we transition. Here.
Hello?
Yep,
I
go
went
ahead.
on my own little search. I didn't know what the origin of economic energy was. The very, very origin. So not fiscal tools, not government, just where does it... And the very origin is when a business starts. Not many people know that. In the United States, when we were really doing our best work was between 1870 and 1970. Left-leaning and right-leaning economists all agree, but America exploded. This city exploded. And we invented everything and changed the world and all that. Now we don't do it so much. But what happened is startups have slowed. And so during the real good times, we were starting about 600,000 a year with an employee. And now it's gone down to about 385,000. But if you said, how do you put America, Detroit, or I'm originally from Nebraska, all over Nebraska, you get people to start up. But this is one of the damnedest things I think I've seen at Gallup. We got the list of the Inc. 500 fastest growing companies 2 years. Those were really valuable Americans. They start real fast growing companies. The more those you have, the more this place booms, the more good jobs you have with a living wage and all that kind of a thing. But and most of them cooperated. Let's say we had 600 or 800 of them. We're trying to figure out how they think differently than the regular people to see if you could match it up. And big surprise, they have huge determination. They run through walls. But this is the finding. When God has handed things out, he hasn't handed them out evenly. One is speed. Somebody's the fastest in this room and somebody's the slow. You see what I mean? But he was very egalitarian when he handed out the traits of building a business. And if so, the question is, how many Steve Jobs types do you have down in these areas of these kids? The answer is 5 in 1,000, and it's the same with any population you look at. The president of Mexico, Peña Nieto, had us test 80,000 poor Mexicans. I emphasize poor because poor is different there than what Americans think poor is. And it was exactly the same. And what you could do is you could match them up with those same thought patterns and life themes. Do you see what I mean? But then the trick is to spend all the time and invest the money in those types. I'm going to crudely compare it to sports. So in a high school 5-star quarterback's coming out of Los Angeles or whatever, everybody wants. But so you could do the same thing here. But I would encourage you, one of your takeaways is I get real interested in who the entrepreneurs are, because that's where the magic is. And it's really best if economic energy comes up and out of the people there, the hearts and minds of the people, rather than the government helping. That's from a guy that likes free enterprise, but I think that's what I was going to say.
Is there
these slides are going home.
Yes.
And I'll be quick through this section because I know everybody's got questions they want to get into. So Camille asked me to do this part, I think, either to rest her feet or because I'm a social scientist by training. And one of the things that we wanted to really start thinking about today, so we discovered a lot about the current state of how people are doing. But we want to start thinking about what do we do about that? And where do we go from here? And what can this data do to inform the kinds of local policies that are going to help change things on the ground? And Jim, your point about entrepreneurship is a great example of this idea of economic mobility, socioeconomic mobility. This is something most people in the room are probably familiar with, have probably heard research on this to some extent. And what's interesting is that as people are studying this, they're trying to understand what are the factors. This one way of looking at it is that allow somebody to live the American dream, which is I'm going to do better than my parents did, right? We want our kids, the next generation, to be able to do better. Well, if you look at it, in some parts of the country, in some parts of the world, kids who grow up in poverty are significantly more likely to be able to move up out of poverty than in other parts. You look across the US, you can highlight all the counties and you can see the variation. And so the researchers have studied what are the factors in a community that make a difference to that. And that's the right-hand of the slide here is an example of some of those key factors. So this is not exactly sort of the standard model, but it's a good analog to the data we've collected here. And the basic idea is that you need to have some good things in place. You need to have some basics covered in your community, but you really also need to have the opportunity to go and do something. And so education is a huge part of this. Access to opportunity is a huge part of this as well. Social connections between people of different social classes, of different groups. So like equality of connection is a huge factor. This is another one in the research that has been really interesting lately, is that who your friends are. This is something Nicholas Christakis is a social scientist out of Yale who's done a lot of this work, but who your friends are is more predictive of what your life outcomes are going to be than what the income of the neighborhood you grew up in was. That those connections make a big difference, and it's because people are seeing things, they're seeing role models, they're getting access to opportunities, they're getting introduced to people. There's a lot that goes into that. And so what we wanted to do is we wanted to look at, within the survey, what were some of the questions that could map up and align with some of these drivers that we care about. So the first way of looking at this kind of overall concept of economic mobility, is looking and saying, among these domains that we really care about, so education and employment opportunities, access to neighborhood services, social capital, and satisfaction with neighborhood qualities. If we look at all of those together, this is like 24 questions that we've taken an average across all of these neighborhoods. This is what overall economic mobility looks like within the city. People in different locations have a different likelihood to have access to the kinds of things that are predictive of them being able to move up and to be successful. And what we wanted to do then is dive into each of these domains as well. So I'm just going to flip through a couple of maps here. Again, thinking about as we look at this data, it's one thing to see an overall score and say, well, that probably looks like a lot of maps that you've seen in the city that line up with other factors. But we can start looking at those subdomains, and what we start to see is there is variation. And so if you follow a particular neighborhood as we look through here, in some neighborhoods, they're going to have higher satisfaction with quality and aesthetics. And so these are things like abandoned buildings in the neighborhoods, satisfaction with snow removal, and fresh air in the community. How beautiful is the area where you live? People have different perceptions of this in different locations. Social capital, another good example here, where in different parts of the city, we're going to see different patterns, different neighborhoods. Some are going to be doing better on these social capital measures. Some are going to be struggling a little bit more. When we talk about social capital, the questions in the survey, these are where we're getting into things like, do you have a lot of connections in your area? Do you have people you can count on? These sort of positive connections and community attributes, right? How do you feel about the people you live with? How do you think people feel about the city as a whole? The next piece is that neighborhood services example. And so this is, you can think about the first neighborhood one as more of the basics, the things that you need. The services, we're getting into things like transportation here, access to outdoor recreation opportunities, access to local markets. Again, we're seeing some variation, and we haven't at this point gone and really tried to dig into specific neighborhoods, specific communities, and say, what's the case study for this particular neighborhood, and get under the hood of it. That's part of what we want all of you to help us with, is to think about, okay, as you're doing your programs, as you're thinking about when you're targeting a neighborhood, how do we start lining this data up and saying, well, this particular neighborhood over here, this is what the profile of need looks like in this area. How can we make sure that we're ensuring the programs are reaching people in this area, that are really meeting the needs that they have? And then over time, are we tracking progress in these areas? So how are we prioritizing and then tracking that outcome? Last one here, is self-explanatory: education and employment opportunities. Again, we see a lot of variation across the city, and we see that this pattern is changing. Again, if you're kind of hot-spotting these neighborhoods. The other thing I want to call out, I probably should have done this at the start, but the maps that you've seen throughout here are sort of just brute buckets, right? We're just looking at the bottom third, the middle third, and the top third. So there's even more variation that we're not seeing here. If we were to show the absolute values for these particular neighborhoods, some parts of the city are doing a lot better than other parts of the city. We just wanted in this presentation to have a really quick way to be able to see kind of good, okay, and struggling in that sense. And then the other thing I wanted to leave you with before we get into the discussion piece is just taking that last one, so education. And one of the things, we've talked about a lot of these outcomes, but something that's unique about doing the survey work is you've got lots of hard statistics on things like graduation rate, right? Everybody can go out and you can look at school quality ratings, and there's a lot of those outcome metrics that we know about. But what we don't know if we don't go talk to people is how that's affecting their perceptions of where they live and their thoughts about the future and their plans for what they're going to do. And so here we're looking at really just two questions on this slide, but really the focus. We've already talked about sort of overall satisfaction, so just 30% of residents are satisfied with the quality of the educational system or schools in their area. But then if we start diving in and we ask this question, this is a hard-hitting question, whoever wrote this one. Do you think children in your neighborhood would be better off or worse off if they attended a school in a different area from where you live? And within the city, the plurality, 44%, think that kids would be better off if they lived in a different neighborhood. That's a heck of a statistic, right? And what we know then is when we think about things like people who want to relocate out of the city, who want to move to the suburbs or move to a different part of the country, is if you look in the bottom left, we're looking at those who just parents, basically, children in the household. We don't know for sure if they're the parents of those kids, but there's children in the household. And we see a couple of things. One is that 50% of those with children in the household think that their kids would be better off in a different neighborhood, a different school district than the one that they're in right now. And the other thing that we see is that the overall, you don't see this on the graph, but the percentage of don't know is a lot smaller. So those don't knows you see in the top, that's a lot of people who are saying, well, I haven't thought about the schools in the area because I don't have kids, or that's not a priority of mine. But the people who are thinking about it really see that this is an issue. And what we're excited to start thinking about now with all of you is what are the other examples from the data that you've heard about today, from the priorities that you're working on, where we could start really diving deep into some of these issues and understanding, hey, at the local neighborhood level, the specific questions that really matter, they're going to help you make better decisions with your programs. And then in addition to that, the other thing I want to be thinking about, something I think is exciting for year two, is we also know that a lot of you have great data. And right now we've got this one data set. It's a great data set. We're really proud of it. We're really excited about what there is to learn there. The plan is we're going to go collect this data again, which, as Jim talked about at the start, it's one thing to know where you stand today. It's something entirely different to know if we're moving in the right direction or the wrong direction over time. And again, how that variation looks. But I'm also really interested to think about what's the data that you all are collecting or that you're relying on today, and how can we start pulling those data points together and doing some more of the modeling work, trying to really understand, let's look at some of those hard outcome indicators, let's look at the survey data, let's go out and let's think about what new questions should we ask to fill that out, and how can we really make sure that we're continuing to just hone in at greater and greater precision on the issues that are really going to make a difference for this community in the long run. And that's that, Q&A.
All right. Thank you. All right, so you all had some questions on your agenda, but also just thinking about any questions about the data that you've seen, and then we'll go into the discussion
Yeah,
questions.
let's do the data questions first.
Okay.
With maybe you and Dan, and then we can get into that, because I'm sure there's questions about the data.
All right.
I just have a clarifying question. You cited a statistic about folks who wanted to move, would leave permanently. Can you clarify, was that move away from their neighborhood? And how many folks would move to another neighborhood in Detroit versus
So we had an overall question of those who want to move, yes or no. So we asked them about if you had the opportunity in the next 12 months, would you want to move? And then we asked those who said yes, where they would want to move. So we have both. And I think, yes. So I think it was on this slide, but we do have a distribution. I don't know why I don't. We do have the distribution, yes, about where people want to move. So we know that 43% of city residents, that's the overall number, but those who want to move, 46% would want to move somewhere else in the city of Detroit or the Detroit suburbs.
I guess I just think that's a really important distinction to me. Like, how many people are wanting to move? Oh, wow, this is such service. How many would want to move within the city versus how many are saying, I want to leave the city completely? So doesn't have to be answered right now, but
I think it's
just
about
think
a
that's
third. I think
important.
it's about 33%. Telly, you could fact check me if I'm wrong. I think that number is about a third that said it was like some other area in the city.
Yeah, I think it was a slide before.
Did I miss it?
Yeah, we have it later. The
Yeah.
question is move away from your current area.
Yeah.
So it could be basically to a different neighborhood in the city, or it could be to the suburbs. And then we looked at what percentage is saying move away in another area but within the city, and who's saying move away to another area but outside the city.
And I should have said at the beginning, this is so exciting. Thank you so
No,
much
no,
for
no.
putting this together.
I get geeky about this, don't worry.
Okay. I was just curious if you looked at mobility cross-tab with the life evaluation scores. So are people who are more satisfied less likely to want to be moving?
Correct, yes. So those who are in that thriving bucket, so we see those Detroiters who are thriving are also less likely to say that they would like to move permanently somewhere else. Yes. We have Anika and Angelica, but who do you want to go for? Do you-
Okay. Hi, Camille. Thank you. Can you remind us, or me, if others remember, how many people were involved in this survey and your methodology? I know that you sent it out through paper, but can you just sort of remind us of that, like top line?
Sure.
The numbers
absolutely.
and the approach.
Thank you for also making sure I get this little softball. I should have started with that. So we almost had close to 12,000 completes in terms of residents. We send out almost 150,000 survey packets to residents that are living in Detroit and the surrounding counties. So essentially, when we look at the numbers across the population numbers, it's about 1 in every 10 households got a packet with a survey from Gallup. So, and then we had almost a little under 12,000 respondents to send back their surveys. Individuals could either fill out their paper survey and mail it back in a self-addressed business reply envelope, or there was a unique QR code on that invite that they could also take this by web.
And I just comment on that the decision to go with that survey design is important for a couple of reasons. One is, as opposed to doing like an online method, we're making sure that we're reaching every household. Everyone has the same probability of being included in the study, so that we can say these numbers, we're confident this really represents the overall city. When we talk about these subgroups, we know that they're representative, and we've got really good confidence in it. The other reason it's important is, other methods we use, sometimes you do phone surveys, again, email, web surveys, is when we get into the mapping piece of it, is we know exactly where people are. So if you're trying to do like a phone survey methodology, you call somebody up, I'll bet there's a lot of different area codes represented in this room on your cell phones, right? People don't answer the phones, they're not necessarily where you think they are. So mailing the packets is part about how we make sure that this can really be a place-based study, that we really know what communities people are in.
Camille, I just wanted to confirm the region is Wayne, Oakland, Macomb. It's not
Yes.
like Washtenaw, Livingston. It's not the MSA. It's just the Tri-County. So just for
Perfect.
everyone's
Thank you
reference.
so much, Christian.
Can I give an update on the question about moving within the city or the suburbs? So we have 13% of those who say they want to move. 13% are saying, I want to move but stay within the city. And then we have 33% who say to the suburbs. 18% somewhere else in the state of Michigan, and 30% to another state, and then about 6% to another country.
Do you have, because you have, it looks like you did some neighborhood mapping, do you have the methodology by mapping, by geography as well?
Yes, what do you mean? So if we have where each respondent location? Yes.
Exactly.
Yes. I think we have a map of it that shows. And some of you all, if you saw the Mackinac, where we mapped it on thriving, and it's coming up. This. So each dot represent every respondent that responded to the survey. The household. Yeah.
So of the 12,000 surveys, were they equal to Metro Detroit and then equal, the portion of them equal to just Detroit? Like what percentage? Was it evenly distributed, or was there a larger percentage that went to Detroit?
A larger percentage went to the city because we disproportionately oversampled young black Detroiters, so young black residents living in the city, because when we got halfway through, we saw that, response rate lagged a little bit for that age group. And so what we went back in with a second round that oversampled young residents between 18 and 34 living in the city, and we did a similar oversample because we want to make sure we have comparable data for those that are in that tri-county area, so we do that. But majority of the respondents came from the city because we oversampled for Detroiters living in the city.
I'm going to come stand by Camille so that people in the back of the room hear my comment on this. Also just because I really like her. But while this map is up, I did want to point out, so we've broken the data up into neighborhoods based on official neighborhood mapping. But when you see all the actual points on the screen, this is another thing that I think is exciting when we think about where we can go with this, is we can bucket those respondents however we want. And so if you have specific areas that you're focusing on, an economic development corridor, or you want to lump a couple of neighborhoods together, or we want to start thinking about looking at things like proximity to different resources. So one example would be like, how far does somebody live from mass transit? Mm-hmm. There's so many ways we can cut this. We haven't gotten into that yet, but because we've done it in this way, that is something, that potential exists for us as we think about year 2 and additional analysis with this data.
So I have a question about your key determinants of well-being. Did you consider access to like food and basic goods and services? Is that collapsed in one of these, or
Yes.
was it just left out?
So it was collapsed in our community and environment measures. So those measures that, might get to it quicker. Yes. So when we think about just the satisfaction with neighborhood services and conditions, so that includes both the aesthetic, the actual services like fire and snow removal and lack of blight, but also access to cultural opportunities, access to recreational areas, access to stores with fresh fruits and vegetables, and also safety. So feeling safe walking alone at night in your area. Okay, we have one behind, and then we'll get to you, Stephanie.
Okay, this is not a data clarification question, but it is about the scope. So I'm curious, what about data or discussion about disparity or perception of it? And part of the reason I'm asking is there was a report released last fall by PolicyLink that went into occupational segregation and other factors of disparity in the Detroit region. And it showed that the median hourly wage for white workers in Detroit with a high school diploma was 12% higher than black Detroiters with a associate's degree. And there were a lot of other data points that map similarly. So it just got me wondering if there's something that we're missing in not looking more at disparity as opposed to just how people of color are faring.
So let me make sure I understand the question. So I think when Dan talked about, so some of those transactional data, so for instance, median income or range, I think that those are things that we can plug into and append the self-reported data. So one of the things that we wanted for this data to do is to be complementary to those hard data, right? So what is it about? So we do know that, okay, so we know that disparity exists in earning, for instance, or wage. Well, how does that manifest itself in Detroiters' everyday life? Well, we see some of the things is that, for instance, let's just look at race on something like worrying about money in the last 7 days. So we do see that one way that that's probably manifesting in Black Detroiters' life is that Black Detroiters are significantly more likely to say that they've worried about money in the last 7 days, right? So that's kind of what I would say is an experiential manifestation of that disparity that we probably see in how much people are earning, right? So that was one way that we were saying we could partner those two data to say, okay, we know this disparity exists in this outcome of wage and income. How is it showing up in people's everyday lives? Well, it shows up in ways of who's able to say, I feel financially secure, or my perception of I can get ahead by working hard, right? So let's look, if we pair those two data points together by wage, for instance, which is an outcome, do we see that people who are making less are also more likely to think that they don't have the opportunity to get ahead by working hard? And what we know about that from these data is that those people are also less likely to be thriving in their overall well-being.
We also know another example of a disparity that may be related is that we know that Black residents are, an overwhelming majority of Black residents are reporting that they do want to start a business, but they're also much more likely than white residents to report that they do not have the resources to start a business. So we showed that, we showed those numbers.
I really appreciate that. I just, part of why I'm bringing it forward is it seems like part of the goal of this information is to guide policy and action. And so the more that I think we can layer in the conversation about disparity, the more relevant our actions will be.
Absolutely, 100% agree. So we have Stephanie and then Marnita. It looks like you have, I'm going to look to Marnita.
Okay, so I have Rodney, then I have Stephanie, then I have Dr. Hudson.
Okay.
Quick question. I think I heard the respondent's length of time as a city resident referenced earlier, at least related to one of the questions. I'm just curious if that is something that was looked at across all the questions, and if you saw anything in the data as it relates to the length of time that the respondent has been a city resident.
Yes, so we did it, and we picked this one as the most important. No, we did. We did look at the data, and primarily just for the deep dive. So we are able to look at every question based on length of time living in the city, and so we also can look at who's thriving, right? And what we see is that the longer you live in the city, the higher percent of those folks that are thriving, which is in line to kind of some of what we know about the overall measure about thriving, that older adults tend to more likely to be thriving. We see that trend holding up for city residents. So the longer you live in the city, you would assume that you've also been living longer. And so we have been able to, one of the things that we're highlighting here related to just the number of years living in the city is we looked at it just in the context of this question right now for the that you're seeing on the slide on those who are likely to move permanently. And what we see is that the longer you're living in the city, the less likely, the less of a desire you have. Right? Yeah. Yeah.
The other, I would just add one comment on both of the last questions. This, we're still, this is I think the fourth or fifth time we've presented different versions of this data, and we're still just scratching the surface of what we have available. And so this is an example of something for you all to be sharing with us. If there are specific priority populations, or there's intersections of different demographic variables, or things like we want to focus on long-term city residents that meet certain characteristics, we have a lot of survey respondents here, and so we can do those sorts of analyses and come back, or look at data where we're looking at the full distribution and what's the shape of the distribution of data. Do we see that there's more inequality within a particular question? All of those sorts of questions are things that we would love to get into and make sure that as we move forward with this project, we're getting you exactly the data you need for your priority populations and for the questions you're trying to answer.
So I just had a quick question. How long was this survey and when exactly did it take place? What's the timeline?
Sure. So the survey was 8 pages long. And we fielded fall of 2022 to the winter of 2023.
Can I go now?
Oh, okay. Hi. So my question was around how you disaggregated the data based on gender, and specifically what I was interested in was the quality healthcare questions and the well-being. Just knowing that we have pretty much the worst rates, not even in the country, but around the world, for Black maternal mortality and infant mortality. And I didn't know how that showed up here, but I was surprised that it wasn't more glaring in terms of what people are experiencing here, knowing the battle we're having right now with that issue.
Tully, you want to talk about the gender?
Yeah, so in the models that we ran, if I remember correctly, and I can check just now, but I don't think gender was a significant factor that emerged in the models. Basically, we did not see that men and women reported different levels, statistically significant different levels of well-being. And I can check that again. But something else that the models did, we controlled for all the demographic factors. So basically controlling for things like gender, race, age. What are some actionable characteristics that contribute to people's well-being, right? So such as satisfaction with aesthetics and services in the neighborhood. So we looked at those more actionable correlates, controlling for the demographic variables.
Was the question asked about whether they were single female-headed households, or anything around marital status? Or
Marital status, yes.
Yeah, we do have the ability to, so if you wanted to say, well, let's kind of like isolate with this group and look at it among women who live in the city who have these characteristics, we do have that ability to do that. But I think to just also, I would say refine what the point in the model for the thriving and those determinants, it's not that it's not important, but when we say controlling for all things like this, what are those determinants? We don't want to call them driver because then I'm gonna get in trouble with Telly. The determinants for whether or not you're thriving, it's not that it wasn't important, but the determinants that we showed were bigger predictors rather than what your gender identified as, male, female. So that's not that there weren't differences, but when we start to think about what was driving how you were rating your life, right? That once we started to control for gender, we didn't see that much of a determining factor related to that. Hold on.
Can I make a comment?
No? Yes?
So some data that I've seen of Camille's work is that Black men and women experience discrimination equally in cafes, healthcare, that kind of thing. Not in the workplace. And so there's a delta between men and women. Men have a pretty good time in the workplace. Our first National Day, National Day is probably here. But women, so we say we treat with 100%, something like 100% respect all day at work. Women are significantly less likely to are significantly more likely to report not being respected in the workplace. That's one place you can find it.
Women or black women?
Black women
I was
are,
doing all black.
Yeah.
I was doing all black. Black men, black women.
all right. Marnita, we,
I don't want to go back. I disagree with that, but I'm sorry.
So,
I can't see how that's possible.
Would he, just the,
I know plenty of Black men who don't have that type of experience at work. So I'm just trying to, is that for the whole country or?
That was the whole country.
that was the whole country. So what we look at, when we look at it across the intersection of race and gender, we see that Black women were least likely to report, at work I'm treated with respect. Black men's scores on that item were very similar to white men. So the disparity between who feels respected at work, there was a larger disparity among Black women. And when we compare Black women to white women and Hispanic women, Black women were the lowest. When we compare, Black women were the lowest overall across gender, across race and ethnicity. Okay.
So one question, maybe you could answer, and it might get to what you're describing. I'm having a little trouble distinguishing between the kind of ACS and other standardized data that a lot of what we're using that might tell us a different story, as opposed to the kind of survey data you're receiving. So that's one that I'd like for you to elaborate on generally. Because I think that'll help us think about how to narrate this in the public. The second question is, the percentage rate still seems really low, the respondent rate. And so how is that normal for all of your panel surveys? Just because when we've done other panel surveys locally, we've gotten a higher response. And we know that this is probably the most challenging form of survey. And so if you could answer those two.
Sure.
I'd take the second one first and get that one out of the way. So we're not using our panel, so that's one thing. So if we do a survey with a panel where we already have respondents, we expect more like a 25%, 30% response rate. For a community survey where we're mailing out the packets like this, 10% it's what we budget for. We assume we're gonna hit 10%. In a community that has really high engagement rates or the program's really well known, maybe we get up into the teens, but this is not atypical for an overall response rate.
Correct. And then the other question was, how do you contextualize these data with the other data? I think one of the ways I'd put it is, most of the other data is probably around those outcomes, right? So I think there was a question about just what we see in terms of the disparity. This is more experiential, right? So the way we ask the questions and the questions that we're interested in asking is less so much about counting whether you have this or don't have this. I mean, we have some of those questions, we consider those demos, but it's more around what your everyday experience is like. So if you think about the question to say, we know your income, but we also have a question other than how much money you make, and that's a number probably, once we put up those statistics, would be very similar to what you see in terms of the ACS data. But we ask you, well, how do you feel about your present income? Would you say that you feel comfortable, you feel like you're living comfortable on your present income? Are you struggling on your present income? I think that's that experiential context that will partner well with something like household income. Well, okay, so even if you say Detroiters' median household income, which it isn't, is very typical to what we see nationally, but you're saying even if it is, Detroiters are significantly more likely to say that they are struggling to get by on their present income when we compare that measure on a national level from the center. So, right, it's really kind of saying, what do we know about these hard transactional statistics and how it manifests itself in what people are telling us about their everyday experiences, right? So you can say, I make $120,000 a year, but those individuals are also less likely to say that they are more likely to say in Detroit that they're worrying about paying rent or they are having problems finding affordable housing. But that would be very different probably if we were to measure it somewhere else and look at individuals who have that income. So something like that is to say, how do we partner our survey data around everyday life experiences and what we know about these other outcome variables that we tend to have a lot of data and track regularly. Hope that answers your question.
The other, if I could add one piece to that as well, I think I think a lot about health behavior research, and so do a lot of work in the public health space in particular. And so if you take an outcome metric like maternal mortality rates, right, we know we've got to fix that. What do we do to fix that, right? And there's lots of, within the health system, people are looking at, you know, what may be going on, what diagnoses are happening or not happening, and looking at a lot of the things that you can track easily by just counting outcomes or counting procedures or counting complications and things like that. But what those miss is things like trust in the healthcare system, confidence in doctors, the self-efficacy around following doctors' advice, whether or not they think they have the ability to practice healthy behaviors, right? And so what we're doing with this survey data, and you could take this for the economic measures as well, job outcomes or educational attainment, is we're working upstream from those outcome measures and hopefully identifying those points of intervention where you can come in and say, I know I have this issue with this outcome measure, what do I need to do? Well, maybe I need to focus on educating people about resources that are available, or I need to focus on developing certain sorts of skills. And I'm giving hypothetical examples now, but that idea of the subjective data, the self-reported data, is how we get upstream from those outcomes so that we can actually make change where it matters for people instead of waiting for the outcome.
And I'm going to take that softball, Dan, because you mentioned health and experiences. So what we see on the national data, for instance, with health experiences and trust, is who's more likely to say that they've had an experience within the last 3 years with discrimination. And discrimination as measured as somebody didn't listen to what you were saying or didn't think you were telling the truth about how you were feeling. And what we see is that 25% of black women are significant, which is a significantly more likelihood of saying that they'd had one of these experiences in the last 3 years, and how that kind of plays into those outcomes that Dan just mentioned. So that's something that we're also tracking nationally, right, is people's experiences with discrimination while receiving care. How does that show up in terms of those outcomes? You just gave me that softball, and I had to drop that step. All right.
All right, good afternoon. I had a question about the data that was lifted around discrimination and the difference between black men and women reporting. And I was wondering, did you all take also the lens applied to that data that determines how minoritized populations respond to surveys, particularly job satisfaction, and how they rate themselves even in doing a well done job? So I just wondered if, understanding that, are we also applying like that equity mindset and lens and thinking and considering about how black men and black women respond to surveys within the workplace?
I love that question, because when we saw that finding, it was astonishing, right? That there was that disparity just between what we saw. And first, we asked surveys, so these weren't employer surveys. So because the national study that we do, we ask anybody. We don't ask you where you work. So there's kind of a little bit of kind of making sure that people don't feel like, you know, we're watching them for their employer versus like an employer-led employee survey that might ask that question, which we do at Gallup all the time for our, you know, employee engagement surveys and culture audit surveys, right? So we'd ask that question at work, I'm treated with respect. But on the national study, so it's not a employer survey, so it's kind of outside of the context of we don't know where you work or who you work for on those surveys. So to the point of when we saw that, for me, it was like, wow, it was very counterintuitive to probably what I would have perceived that would be. And in some qualitative conversation, it was, so what is it? Why do we see that? And I think that there's some explanation that I've heard around this aspect of, you probably can discriminate against me. This is from black male, don't have that lived experience, but it's like, but what you will not do is disrespect me, right? And how that is contextualized and interpreted when we ask that question to say, at work I'm treated with respect. It says, you might discriminate against me, but what you will not do is disrespect me. I did not understand that dynamic and that context in the way the question is asked and around the word and the use of the word respect. So that was one kind of qualitative feedback around the question and the finding when we did some follow-up.
Yeah, so I also want to.
Yeah, I had just a question as far as, especially when you drew that distinction between discrimination and disrespect.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of times it's because it is believed that the discrimination is inherently a part of the system for which I'm participating. So the discrimination is par for the course,
Mm-hmm.
but the expression that there's discrimination in the form of disrespect is what I think that we may be missing there. Because the belief is, as a black man in that system, that inherently the system is discriminatory.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to mention one other example from our national studies on this is we asked people about their career aspirations. And so, you know, we have to simplify this in order to do it, but, you know, saying, you know, do you want to be a CEO someday? Do you want to be a manager someday? And we asked this across the representative sample of the workforce. And again, and when we looked at the intersectionality of gender and race and what people's aspirations were, we see some different patterns. We see, you know, mostly men are slightly more likely to have these sort of senior level aspirations in their career, but it's a small gap. It's not a significant gap. But then when we looked at asking a follow-up question of how likely do you think you will be able to achieve that goal, we saw this really big gap start to open up. And so you see a gap by race start to emerge, but then also a gap by gender emerging. And so people having similar aspirations, but not necessarily believing that they're going to be able to get there. And I just mentioned that as an example of, I think it can be really hard to get in and measure stereotype threat or these kinds of concepts we're talking about here of what does discrimination mean for this individual, And one of the things we're interested in is what are other ways we can try and cut at that data and come at that from a different angle. So I think there's probably other interesting examples like that we could come up with, but wanted to throw that one out there.
So I also want to express gratitude for this, and I appreciate the kind of very city focus, and I'm very excited about the ability to get down at a more granular neighborhood level. But in the back of my mind, I'm also wondering, how does Detroit compare with the region? How does Detroit compare with the U.S. more generally from your data? Any kind of headlines that you're finding in terms of stark differences in those questions?
Okay, all right, Peter, you're going to cause me to pull back, see how much I can recall. So I know we shared the thriving, but one of the things that we know in terms of some of the key areas around satisfaction with, for instance, school, satisfaction with the availability of affordable housing, that we do know that Detroit residents lag significantly behind the national numbers that we see among Black Americans, but also the U.S. population. So there are particular areas around aspects of life that we do see Detroiters lagging behind our national measures. And particularly the two that comes top of mind is how they rate their satisfaction with the quality of the education system and the affordability, availability of affordable housing. All right.
Hi, thank you for this. One of your questions was, how do you overlay your work with other ongoing work locally? And I just wanted to lift up the University of Michigan's Detroit Metro Areas Community Survey. It's 2,000 representative residents of Detroit who really are a very valid group, and statistically, and are asked a lot of questions about their experiences. So I think there's a real sweet spot in how that survey works to combine experiences with sort of emerging outcomes. And so I would just really encourage you to work closely with the expertise there. They have a different approach. They're social workers. You know, they don't get featured at big conferences, but they are really steady and they are great at partnering.
Absolutely, love that idea, thank you. And I think we met in some of the design with Elizabeth.
Incredible presentation, thank you so much. Curious about the fact that this is also about experience. You talked about aspirations and attitudes. You mentioned the American dream. I'm curious, two kind of data points that stood out in that context related to youth is the perception around not being able to get ahead with hard work, and then also youth who want to move out of state. Did you see kind of perceptions around people believing in a dream, the ability to reach goals, hope, and kids wanting to move out?
So I think I know we could look at it specifically for 18 to 34-year-old Telly, but we know directionally for those that don't perceive that they have the ability to get ahead by working hard, much more likely to say that they would move if given the opportunity. So we do know that directionally that's there. We'd have to see this, to what extent do we see the differences by age, but that should be interesting to see. Yeah.
So we don't have the analysis on hand. We did see the example of youth being less likely to be satisfied with education in the area. But the thing I wanted to call out, so Camille talked about this slide, and we said the number one reason to move is crime, right? Mm-hmm. The rest of them are hope, is what I see when I look at this, right? Is the rest of them are a better place for my children, opportunities, education, cost of living. I can't live the lifestyle I want to live in this area where I live. And so, crime will chase people away, but all the other ones are things that they say, I can get something better somewhere else. And that's definitely something when we look at these questions that youth are definitely going to look different on. So thank you for that question. Yeah.
The best definition of the great American dream is still to have a good job.
Okay.
Now, it's not everybody, but that's the biggest, if I had a pie graph, that's the biggest one. There's a little caveat on that, with a living wage. And that's why unemployment is such a misleading number, because you got 60% of America that's broke. Okay, but to your other point, what you really want to fill a person's body with, especially young people, is hope. If you just pick one thing, fill that body with hope. And almost everything gets better. But that's why
the best question to follow is thriving, because remember, the question is, on a scale of 0 to 10, with 0 being the worst life imaginable. So I got the worst life I can imagine. That's what I have. 10 is the best life imaginable, where I don't envy anybody. The money questions, let's say I say I'm a 7. Ashley's a 7 also. The money question is, where will you be on that same scale in 5 years? Ourselves, academics, 2 Nobel Prize winners, they all think we found hope in that question. Mathematically describe hope. Because she says I'll be a 9, and old Jim says you'll be a 3. You found hope in her, in that delta. And we say, well, why are you so happy? Well, she's starting a motorcycle shop and renting things, and she's going to have a bunch of money, and she's hiring her sister and a whole bunch of things. And me, I don't have the skills to get a job at it. You see what it is? But we think if you want to know how much hope there is, you got the American dream. That's always the same thing. Job, living wage. It's not as much about owning a house anymore for the people in real estate. You know, the young people would rather spend their money to go to Cabo or somewhere like that rather than buy a house. They get married 15 years later. They have half as many kids. They're truly very, very different. But you still want to have, but hope works, and getting them a good job with a living wage works.
All right. So we have maybe 2 more questions before we go to wrap up this.
Thank you. Camille, I just think that this is fascinating information. My question for you is, based on the information and maybe the statistical sample size that you have, do you feel like you have enough comparative data that represents enough of the census tract, right, where you can truly use it and to say this is the majority of the voices and we need policy change based on this? Do you feel like you have enough of a sample size to really impact change?
I would say yes, and here's why. The fact that we, and our statistician tells us, if you could say, was there an opportunity where 1 out of every 10 households had an opportunity to participate in the study? But also the fact that we are weighting this data back and the volume of responses that we have at 12,000, I think being able to not just look at that overall level, but to be able to also weight that and represent it at the intersections of race and age, the intersection of race and gender, I think it's very much representative. I think it's a robust data set that is allowing us the ability to really look at disparities or differences in people's experiences across a number of important items and elements, where when we started this survey, we say it would be important to see how Detroiters are doing on this, but to also understand what or who isn't doing well on what, and I think that this answers that question. The statisticians will tell you it's weighted to be representative. When we cut the data by those major buckets, it still remains representative, and I think it's the robust nature in which we have over 12,000 respondents. This is a very large study of this type, so when you think about studies that you've seen, and having the ability to, the deeper you go, you're going to lose representativeness, or you're going to lose that analytical power. The fact that we have 12,000, we can go deeper and still say these are stable estimates that we have weighted, and that's representative.
All right. I think, listen, we want to be really respectful of the time, and I know we've already lost a handful of people. First of all, Camille and Dan, thank you so much for coming and doing this. So here's what I'm going to do a little bit of an audible here, and hopefully this will work for everybody. Again, we want to be really respectful of the time, so we're not going anywhere, but we want to allow those who need to depart for their next appointment go ahead and do that. I want to summarize and maybe talk a little bit about next steps right now. So first of all, just kind of a reminder. I mean, this has been a really rich discussion, and I just want to remind everyone as you kind of walk away from here, and as you take your packet, which I assume is on the other side of this wall, with all the slides. This was always meant to be a companion research piece, data piece, to existing data and particularly existing data organizations already in the region. When Gallup did their work in creating the Detroit-specific survey, they worked with all of the members of the Blueprint Group plus all of their partners, and I think we had, 50, 60 different entities from the area, including the University of Michigan Poverty Solutions Center, the University of Michigan, the one that you mentioned, all part of that inputting into this. So it was a very broad, a broad input pool. The second thing I want to say is this is year one, volley one. And our whole goal was to get this survey in the field with all of the input that we had, with all the partners that we had, and learn from it and then figure out where to go from here. Where do we need to go deeper? Where are the interests that didn't get covered? And are there specific areas or interests that that organizations, either philanthropy or service organizations or data organizations or companies for that matter, want to go deeper, and then let's figure out how we do that and how we price for that and how we at the Detroit Regional Chamber go out and raise the money for that so we can continue to do this work. So we have, obviously a follow-up conversation that we all need to have about kind of what's next steps. There's a lot of, we call this a deep dive. There's way deeper to go here, and so what we want to work on now is make sure that all of the information that that Gallup has already pulled becomes broadly available. Right? This is not proprietary information. It's not for Gallup. It's not for the Detroit Regional Chamber. It's for the entire community. It's for anybody who wants it. So we want to work with you to make sure that it is easily accessible. The second thing we want to do is we want to make sure that all of the great data organizations that are out there, and many of you are in this room, including the Chamber, we've got a tremendous data team. How do we make sure that all of the data that impacts our city and our region are kind of equally and easily available, so you can look at some of the hard data coming from this organization coupled with the well-being data coming from Gallup, and we kind of mix and match, and you can kind of create your own. We also want to we want to get to the point where we've got the resources to be able to put this on a site that we all share, and it allows people to kind of create really easy customizable data sets for your organization, for your business, for your community group, whatever it is. Obviously, we're not there yet. We got to figure out how to do that. Kristen's Lucas in the back, who's our director of research, is sitting in the back, is like going, I can't do that right now. But hopefully we'll get the resources to be able to do that. So, and then finally, what I think all of our ultimate goal is the understanding that data is data. Data really doesn't matter unless we're able to do something with it and track it. And so what we're really hoping that this is a catalyst for collective action. So we want to continue this conversation with this group about how do we make this more into collective action as opposed to, oh, this is really interesting data. So if this is just really interesting data, we have not done our job. So I'm going to kind of formally break this portion of the program now. Feel free to stick around a bit, talk to the folks from Gallup, talk amongst yourselves, and then we'll figure out kind of maybe via Zoom to kind of convene this group again. So thank you all for coming. Thanks again to our friends from Gallup. Have a great rest of your day.